Okay, after the resignation of Nixon, we had Ford take the presidency, and we've already talked about how he became president, having never been elected to the presidency or the vice presidency. He did assign a new vice president, and his name was Nelson Rockefeller, to fill the vice presidency. And then he made a controversial decision. President Ford was so beset by questions about Nixon and whether Nixon was going to be tried in the criminal courts for obstructing justice and covering up the Watergate scandal. And this was a perfectly legitimate expectation on the part of the American people, that the president could be tried as a citizen who had committed crimes. But Ford decided that the whole issue was becoming such a distraction and the nation really would be best served by moving on, that he made a controversial decision to just pardon Nixon, and he was not going to be tried, and we're going to put the whole situation behind us. Most historians look back on this as probably a pretty wise decision, but we also can see how the American people at the time thought this was kind of a cover-up, or it was controversial. It seemed like the ex-president was above the law. And perhaps Ford hadn't really laid the groundwork to bring about this pardon. But that is what he decided to do nonetheless, announced it to the American people, and moved on. Part of what he wanted to focus on in the 1970s was a very sick economy. The economy was beset by a problem called stagflation, and stagflation is very rare, but when it happens, there's really no clear way to solve it, and that's still the case today. The reason is that it combines two variables that don't usually happen at the same time. The first one is high unemployment. High unemployment usually leads people to fear for losing their jobs because they don't think they'll be able to find another one. So they usually don't spend their money when there's high unemployment. And therefore, usually demand for products is very low, and so prices stay low. So high unemployment usually leads to low inflation. High inflation usually happens during a time of maximum employment, when everyone's employed and they're feeling very positive about the economy and they're spending lots of money and there's not enough goods, and so prices go up because suppliers realize that they can charge higher prices. So it's very unusual for high unemployment and high inflation to happen together. The causes of inflation in the 1970s were that all the oil-producing countries of the world decided to get together and quit competing against each other to produce as much oil as possible, which drove prices down. And they decided to start pumping a smaller amount of oil so that they could pump oil over a longer period of time, since it is a limited resource, and that would lead prices to rise, and they would grow more wealth as a result of conserving their resources and get more money for the oil they had. Also, Arab nations that were opposed to our support of Israel, they just quit selling oil to us altogether. So gas prices went through the roof, and in some cases we actually had to ration gas in the 1970s. Unemployment was high during this time period too, around 10%. This was caused by two things. First of all, there had been a decline in manufacturing in America. Most of your parents today probably don't make money by working in a factory making stuff. They probably make money by selling what they know. That's what I'm doing right now. Or they provide services, perhaps as plumbers or beauticians, or they provide something, they sell their knowledge or their abilities without actually working in a factory and producing physical things. Those jobs tend to go to other countries where there are fewer environmental protections and lower wages. Now, the people who had typically been working in a factory their whole life, they're not well suited to move into these other service sector jobs. They might not have had algebra in 25 years or whatever. So there's going to be a period of adjustment in our nation's education economy to get people well matched to the new service-related economy we have. The second reason that we had high unemployment is that the Germans and the Japanese, we had rebuilt them after World War II, and they had actually become very efficient at making high-quality electronics and automotives that were outselling us. This is when we get Sony and Toyota and Volkswagen. And therefore, their manufacturing is going great, and they're selling lots of their cars and electronics in our economy. But they're outselling us, and no one's buying our products, which leads to layoffs and closings of factories. So that led the economy to be really troubled. Ford tries to solve it through a program called whip inflation now, but he called for people to voluntarily not increase prices and to not lower wages. But this is a capitalist free market economy. The president can't really set prices or wages, and that was not very effective. He also tried to create jobs by spending more on the part of the government and lowering taxes, but those approaches actually made inflation worse because it put more money in the economy. So he was not very successful at addressing the economy, and therefore was not reelected in 1976. Most people, he died in 2006, most people who were covering his presidency and talking about his legacy agreed that he was exactly what the country needed at the time in terms of being a transparent and honest person. But he just drew a bad hand in terms of when he was president, and the post-Vietnam stagflation era would not have been kind to anyone because they're intractable problems that are not easily solved. These same problems were inherited by our next president, and his name is Jimmy Carter. He was a total outsider from Washington. He was a one-term governor from Georgia, a peanut farmer. He talked a lot about his faith, and his faith was kind of fundamentalist Christian. And he was not tainted by Washington, but that also meant he had no connections in Washington to call upon. And he brought a lot of his own staffers from Georgia with him, and they didn't have a lot of connections in Washington either. He had to deal with the same domestic oil inflation and fuel problems that the earlier president had to deal with. We also had some very harsh winters in the 1970s. And so all of this was continued our troubling dependence on oil and kind of made us feel vulnerable because of that. His solutions made perfect sense in a textbook. They were things like taxing gas-guzzling cars so that people would abandon their gas-guzzling cars. But we had a gas-guzzling car in the 1970s, and we didn't really have the money to buy a new one. And it kind of was a bit of an insult to be, therefore, punished for having a large car with higher taxes. Also, he allowed gas prices to rise, which is natural in a free market economy, but it sure did put a pinch in people's budgets and made people, again, feel frustrated about the increasing inflation in their household costs. He also cut spending and allowed interest rates to rise, but those solutions cut down on demand for products and therefore led to greater unemployment. So Ford made the inflation problem worse, Carter made the unemployment problem worse, while inflation was still an issue as well. He gathered some people together from all over the nation to advise him during this time period, and he, as a result of those discussions, made a speech on TV called the malaise speech. A malaise is when you're just kind of feeling kind of icky. And the speech was really well received that night. People thought, yeah, Jimmy really told us how it was going, and yes, America has problems. It was only days later that they realized that he hadn't really proposed any solutions, and they became increasingly frustrated with the fact that the president seemed unable to offer any solutions. His foreign policy was as different from Nixon's foreign policy as night and day. If you recall, Nixon had decided that we should focus on being realistic or pragmatic in our foreign policy and considering power as our major and being practical. Carter wanted to be idealistic. He was all about doing what was ideal or moral, and he actually made our relationships with countries like China and the Soviet Union worse because he kept harping on them about human rights. He basically said if you didn't provide your people with the basic protections under the Bill of Rights, so we're talking about freedom of speech, assembly, press, right to trial by jury, that due process, that those countries and us we should distance ourselves from them. So we actually saw our relationship with those countries decline. For example, it was during this time period that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and we, in a way to punish them, boycotted the Moscow Winter Olympics. So it was that kind of example that made our relationships worse. Another example of his idealism is he just thought it was wrong that we owned 10 miles of land through all of Panama around the Panama Canal. So he agreed to give it back. And 20 years later, we did give the Panama Canal back. That might not have been in our military and strategic interest, but he thought it was the right thing to do. The most fascinating part of Carter's foreign policy is related to the Middle East. He was a biblical scholar and very interested and knowledgeable about the region. He knew that as a result of the Six-Day War in 1967, that Israel had gained a whole lot of territory. The 5 Arab nations around Israel attacked Israel. Israel, with military support from the countries that helped establish it after World War II, was able to defeat those nations, and all of this land you're looking at here in yellow is the land they gained. So Carter looks at this and he says, hey, Egypt lost the entire Sinai Peninsula as a result of this war. Maybe we can get Egypt to recognize Israel if Israel will give back the land. That became the basis for the most significant progress we've ever made in the Middle East. He spent weeks with these two men. On the left in this picture is Anwar Sadat, and on the right is Menachem Begin, the leader of Israel. You can see them shaking hands here with President Carter. They made a deal that Egypt would recognize Israel and say that it was a legitimate nation that had a right to exist, and that Israel would then return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. While this was an impressive and amazing accomplishment in Middle East history, it's also the fact that when both of these men went back to their home countries, they were both assassinated. Because within both of those countries are radical interests that have no desire to see this kind of peace accord be made. And so you can see why it's so hard to drive for further peace negotiations in the Middle East. Kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of Carter's popularity, though, involves this country, Iran. You can recall that in Iran in the 1950s, they had a move towards communism that was kind of frightening to us. So we overthrew, the CIA helped train and overthrow rebels to overthrow their government and put in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the king of Iran. He was called the Shah. This is him and his son and his wife. His wife was actually a teenager. He swept off her feet in the 1950s and married. And so this became kind of a Cinderella story that was known in America. These people ruled Iran with somewhat of an iron fist and were not necessarily the nicest people to their population, but at least they were capitalist, if corrupt. Well, they had within Iran a fundamentalist Muslim movement. And they had a cleric, and that's the guy in the top left-hand corner. His name is the Ayatollah Khomeini. They wanted to overthrow the Shah and establish a Muslim state, which eventually they did. And so, just to clarify here, as you can see here on the screen, Iran hates us for supporting the Shah. And so they revolt, and they overthrow the Shah, and guess where the Shah comes? The Shah, the king of Iran, flees to the United States. They want the Shah back. They have plans to try him, torture him, make an example out of him. We refuse to give the Shah back, and as a result, they decide to try and take hostages, Americans, 52 white men, hostages from the embassy in the United States Embassy in Iran. They kidnapped them and they held them, and were demanding the Shah's return before they would hand back our 52 Americans. We refuse, and before the whole thing can be solved, the Shah dies of natural causes in America. We go to try and rescue our men in Iran, and actually the rescue attempt fails, and 2 of the helicopters ran into each other, and 8 U.S. Military personnel die. And this whole thing was just a debacle. Every night on TV, Walter Cronkite would sign off with how many days the hostages had been held in Iran: 52 days, 100 days, 120 days, 200 days, just growing and growing and growing. And the frustration of Americans with the fact that we seemed incapable of doing anything about this was just really, really growing and impossible to solve. So Carter had to stand for re-election during this time period, and it's kind of clear how this went. People were ready for a change, and they elected Ronald Reagan. And it was not until after Reagan was inaugurated that they actually let the hostages go. So that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. We'll be talking more about this court case, University versus Bakke, in class. It basically, during this time period, said that you could not have quotas for minorities in college admissions. Most people agree that Carter just wasn't that effective as a president. He had good ideas, but he really couldn't get anything done, and he had these unsolvable economic problems. And while his Camp David Accords were genius, the hostage crisis kind of overshadowed that as they took place after the Camp David Accords were signed. So Carter, one-term president, and our next president we will discuss will be Ronald Reagan. See you in class.